All right. So people can hear me? All right. So first, I should say that I'm commenting on the handout. That's what Seth gave me a couple days ago. So just bear in mind that many of these thoughts are about 18 hours old. So I'm going to say a little bit about Section B, a lot about Section C, and a little bit about Section D. So a quick point on collectivism and just war theory. I guess I'm more sanguine about the possibility of developing a reductivist account that fits our basic understanding of proportionality. I mean, I agree with Seth that if each individual combatant considers the consequences of her actions in isolation from the others, then this might lead to a grossly disproportionate campaign. But in my view, we can avoid this consequence without embracing anything like group agency, and Seth does demur on this, by considering the reasons that apply to individuals in virtue of their role in the collective. So as some here know, I'm a fan of role-based responsibility for what one does in war, where the role takes as its object a reference to the goals of the group in which one is participating. But whereas I've only considered role-based moral responsibility for what has happened in war, Seth seems to include role-based positive reasons for action in war. So put differently, on his account, one's role in a war grounds not only one's liability, but what one has moral reason to do. I've only considered the former, not the latter. And I agree that the latter should indeed be considered if we're going to seriously consider role-based ethics in war. But I admit that I'm a bit hesitant to go in that direction, since I'm suspicious of the claim that one's status as a combatant can lead to the permissions to do things that would normally be impermissible. I mean, after all, the manner in which we organize ourselves, our relations to one another, which is a thoroughly private affair as far as our group is concerned, how can these facts possibly affect what I'm permitted to do to you? How is it how we organize can affect what I'm permitted to do to you? But it's much easier to see how we organize ourselves can affect my responsibility for what my cohorts do. So for this reason, I've tended to restrict role-based ethics in war to the realm of moral responsibility for what we do amongst one another, rather than what we have permission to do to others outside the collective. But nonetheless, I think it would be interesting to see, I mean, I'm with Seth, that I think it's interesting to see where we could go with a role-based account of the ethics of war vis-a-vis permissions, not merely liability. So that's all I have to say on Section B. On Section C, the issue of the diachronic versus synchronic framework with respect to proportionality in war. This is an issue that I think what's doing the work underneath all this is the issue of what's sometimes called and what Seth called in an earlier version, sunken costs. I mean, this isn't really the best term for it because in microeconomic theory, it's irrational to allow sunken costs to influence a decision pertaining to an investment. So calling it sunken costs sort of begs the question as to whether we should allow what we've done in the past to affect the proportionality condition determining what we should do in the future. But I still think that there's something like this at issue here. So I'll call it the problem of incurred costs rather than sunken costs. This is a problem of whether and the degree to which, if we do so, we should allow our past investment in a goal to affect what in the proportionality calculation determining what we should do next. And I think this is what's going on in the background here. And so how do we treat incurred costs, specifically the past death of innocents in war? Should we ignore them in our proportionality calculation? So in Seth's view, incurred costs play an evidentiary role only. They provide evidence of a certain sort, evidence regarding the reliability of the means we have chosen in furtherance of our goal. And this evidence is relevant to our calculation of proportionality, determining whether we should try again to achieve X. But incurred costs are not actually included in the proportionality calculation. The 1,000 deaths that we've incurred are not included as costs associated with attempting to achieve X again. They're, in that respect, sunken on Seth's view. So we can distinguish two views here. On a forward-looking view, on a forward-looking account of proportionality, incurred costs are not included in the calculation. They play an evidentiary role at best. On a backwards-looking account of proportionality, incurred costs can indeed be included in the calculation. So Lazar clearly defends a forward-looking account, the synchronic account. He points out that at first, a forward-looking account might seem to implausibly invite infinite losses when we face the same predicament over and over, but he then argues that the probability of such a predicament happening again is included in the expected value calculation, and once we take into consideration that forward-looking conditions include the possibility of the very same choice situation arising in the future, once we include this possibility, it will turn out that the forward-looking account will often counsel doing what the backward-looking account will have us do, which is to stop trying to achieve X again, without including the proportionality calculation, the costs that we've incurred in the past. So this is all well and good. It's a defense of the forward-looking account, that it doesn't have the crazy implications that it originally seems to have. But I think that despite all the math, Seth avoids the hard and fundamental issues pertaining to the morality of incurred costs in war. The fundamental issue which remains unaddressed is whether any version of the backward-looking account is correct. That is, should certain kinds of incurred costs be included in the proportionality calculation, the calculation determining whether we should press on with our goal of trying to achieve X or whether we should cut our losses and stop. So this is the question we have to address when determining how we are to treat incurred costs, whether we are to adopt the synchronic framework or the diachronic framework. And I don't think Seth really addresses it. So let's take one of the many dilemmas he mentions. It would be disproportionate to cause more than 1,000 deaths to achieve X. We attempt, we fail, killing 1,000 innocent people. But now we have evidence suggesting that we can achieve X with no more than 1,000 further evidence deaths, and the evidence is conclusive. Is continuing permissible? In answering this, in my view, we should ask, do we include these incurred deaths in the proportionality calculation determining whether we should try again? And Lazar says no. Sorry, Seth says no. But this is because the only version of the backward-looking account, the only version he considers, is the most implausible version, according to which the incurred costs should be weighed as heavily as prospective costs. So consider an alternate version of the backward-looking account. It might be, for example, that incurred costs ought to be included in our proportionality calculation, but heavily discounted. They appear in our ledger, the cost column of proportionality calculation, but they're not weighed as heavily. But why should they appear at all? Well, the idea might be that there is something morally relevant about the fact that we killed them in furtherance of the very same goals that we are still trying to achieve. There's something morally relevant about this that makes including those deaths appropriate in the calculation, determining whether we're permitted to try again to go for X. So there's a sense in which wiping the proportionality slate completely clean when our goal remains the same disrespects those we have killed in furtherance of that goal by treating them as if we hadn't killed them, or by treating their deaths as mere evidence of how effective our means are. The connection between these incurred harms and our present goal warrants including those harms in our calculation determining whether we should press on. But we should discount those harms in our present calculation since they are not nearly as important as those harms we're in a position to avert. We might say, for example, that incurred death in furtherance of a goal we have failed to achieve should be included in the calculation, but count them as only as heavily as 5% of a full death, just an arbitrary figure that I'm giving. So return to the original dilemma. We have to choose whether to try achieving X again. We've already killed 1,000 in our last attempt. Well, in deciding whether to try it again, we should add 50 deaths to the cost column. To the cost column of the proportionality calculation for the option of trying again, since 50 is 5% of 1,000. Now, some will balk at this suggestion. I ran it past Dick Arneson yesterday, and he said it was interesting, which I think is code for that's crazy. So suppose we have to decide whether to try and achieve X again, which is certain to succeed this time, and doing so will require killing another 1,000 innocents, and it's certain to succeed. So it's all just as before. But now suppose we have another option. We can pursue goal Y instead. Y has the same value as X, and our attempt to achieve that goal is certain to succeed. But doing so will require killing 1,040 innocents. So which should we go for, goal X or goal Y? Now, if this discounted backward-looking view that I've suggested is correct, then the 1,000 we kill in furtherance of X actually counts as 1,050 because we've already killed 1,000. The deaths to gain X gain extra disvalue by their connection to the past, whereas the deaths to gain Y do not because we haven't killed anyone yet in furtherance of Y. So the backward-looking view would say that we should go for option Y, the option that actually kills 40 more innocents. And that might seem strange. So this is a version of a response that Dick gave me, except he didn't think that there should be a 5% discounting, but a 400%. But it's still the objection remains. It seems that it would allow us to do things that would kill more innocents. I think this is a worry, but I think it only shows that our conception of how we should include incurred costs in the proportionality calculation is incomplete. So there's another factor at work here. If we abandon goal X, then those 1,000 innocents will have died in vain. This is bad in of itself. It's another backward-looking consideration. On this view, we might say that when we kill someone in furtherance of a goal, there's inherent value in seeing to it that this person did not die in vain, which provides extra reason in favor of achieving that goal, reason which is included in the proportionality calculation. On this view, we ought to magnify the costs of abandoning the goal, a goal for which innocents have died, but not by much. So we have two backwards-looking considerations here, and these are just, I don't necessarily commit myself to either. The point is that there's these backwards-looking considerations that they interact, and they make the situation more complicated than I think Seth suggests. So one says that harms we have already imposed in furtherance of an unachieved aim should be included as costs, but discounted heavily. And the other backward-looking view pulls us in the opposite direction. It says that the harms we have already imposed in furtherance of unachieved aim should be included as a cost of abandoning that aim. Now, maybe these two backwards-looking views are correct, or maybe one of them is correct. Maybe they cancel out. Maybe one of them is more weighted than the other. But ultimately, what we ought to do should not be determined solely by looking at how many innocents we'd expect to kill in each option. The value of what we do next can be partly affected by what we have done in the past. And such values should be included in the proportionality calculation. Now, this is the sort of reaction I had to myself, and which maybe you have too. You might think that these backward-looking considerations I've mentioned are kind of fluffy. Maybe there's something bad about dying in vain or having our death ignored in the proportionality calculation, but these sorts of bads shouldn't be included in the proportionality calculation when deciding what to do next in war. They're too suspect, they're too hard to measure. We're not nearly as certain about them as we are certain that the death of an innocent is bad. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to adopting a conservative approach to the morality of war. And I'd say, fine, we can adopt a non-fluffy morality of war. But if we're going to do this, we should eliminate all fluffiness from our proportionality calculations, such as the distinction between killing intentionally and killing foreseeably, and the distinction between killing eliminatively and killing opportunistically, which can lead to conclusions where we end up killing more innocents in the proportionality calculation. Barring that, the field is open for all morally relevant considerations, including the backwards ones I've mentioned, which are admittedly just very rough candidates. So there are a host of difficulties here. For example, both of the backward-looking candidates I've mentioned rely on the notion of continuing the same goal. We need an account of what counts as the same goal, just to name one problem. But what these two candidate values are meant to do is to show that there's a whole gamut of prima facie plausible backward-looking values that militate in favor of a backward-looking account, what Seth calls the diachronic account. These are values I think Seth should consider before he rejects the diachronic view. What he does, again, is to reject the diachronic view in only its most brute, simplistic form, that incurred costs ought to count as heavily as future costs. And it seems to me that there are all sorts of intermediate views we ought to consider before rejecting the diachronic view wholesale. Or put differently, there are considerations in favor of the diachronic view which are not captured by Seth's argument from expected value for the synchronic view. So what he says in 23.1 strikes me as wrong for reasons I've given. That the agent should still be guided by forward-looking considerations, can do nothing about those who are already dead, so as TN, he shouldn't allow harms inflicted at earlier times to determine the proportionality of his action. That, I think, is way too quick. So, so much then for incurred costs. So just a few remarks on just negotiation on Part D. I agree that negotiation is of vast moral importance in war and that it's sadly under-theorized, but I have some criticisms of Seth's first pass, specifically on the 4 principles governing negotiation in war, but I'm going to focus on no new rights. So regarding no new rights, the notion is that warfare must only ever be a means to defend pre-existing entitlements. So I'll start with a friendly suggestion. Seth points out that a just victor's right to be compensated does not count as a new right. Neither does a just victor's right to demand political or civil rights, which are previously violated. That doesn't count as a new right either. But instead of stipulating what counts as a new right in a way that comes off as a bit ad hoc, what he wants, I think, is to say that victory in war cannot serve as grounds for new rights, even if victory in war is pragmatically necessary for the fulfillment of these rights. So a right to be compensated is grounded not in one's victory, but in that one was wronged, even if the victory is pragmatically necessary for fulfilling these rights. Likewise, one's political or civil rights is not grounded in victory per se, even if pragmatically necessary, even if victory is pragmatically necessary for the fulfillment of these rights. So I think Lazar ought to state the relevant principle is not solely in terms of the newness of the rights, but rather what grounds it. So victory cannot ground new rights. So I think that's the best formulation of the principle, but even that I think is too quick. I'm not sure the claim is correct, or more carefully, it's only contingently correct. I don't think there's a fundamental moral principle ruling out the possibility of victory grounding new rights. Suppose 2 countries send exploratory ships in search of new land. Both discover an uninhabited, resource-rich island at the same time. Neither state has better claim than the other to it, and neither needs it more than the other. So they go to war over it. One wins, and it demands as a condition of surrender that the loser recognize the winner's right to the land. Now, it isn't obvious to me that this demand isn't acceptable, crucially because no one's rights are being violated in obtaining the land. The land didn't belong to anyone before. This isn't to say that might makes right. If the loser had better moral antecedent claim to the island than the winner does, then the winner could not legitimately demand recognition of the right to the land. So I'm not claiming here that an unjust aggressor which has succeeded in capturing territory can legitimately demand recognition as a condition for peace. Rather, I'm saying that it can do so only if the loser had no more right to the territory than the winner did. So to test this moral view, we can ask, does the losing nation have a right to the island after it has lost? Is it being wronged by being denied the island? Again, assuming that it had no greater claim to the island than the winner does. Does it have a claim right or a liberty right to attempt to regain the island? In my view, the answer is no, no, and no. After all, it had no right to the island in the first place, and if you agree with these conclusions, this suggests that victory in war served as grounds for the victorious nation's new right to the island, one which the losing nation would be violating by attempting to regain the island, to recapture the island after the war. But suppose you disagree. Suppose you say that might does not make right even in this limited case. So after the victorious nation has claimed the island, it still has no more right to it than it did at the outset of the war. There still might be moral reasons for the international community to treat de facto control over land over which no one else has a better claim, as grounding a right to that island. So this might be a case where we have a legal right but no undergirding moral right. So we have reasons for recognizing this legal right for pragmatic, for consequentialist reasons. But that takes us astray. The main point is that the principle that victory does not ground new rights strikes me as contingently true in this day and age where unjust wars have aims that, if achieved, tend to violate the territorial or political rights of the loser. But it just so happens that we live in a world where there are few, if any, unexploited resources or land these days. But wars need not have been always like this. Sorry, wars are not always like this, and they need not always be like this. If I'm right, the principle that victory does not ground rights may be more of a heuristic than a principle. So the upshot is that the relation between victory and war and the rights such victory grounds is more complicated than Seth thinks, which only shows that, again, this is an under-theorized topic, which needs to be explored more. Oh, that's it.